to understand what it is that Kant's doing and why he's talking about things in this way. So Kant lived in the mid to late 1700s, and again, he was writing during this really influential political, philosophical, scientific, moral movement in Europe called the Enlightenment. Right? Ever since the beginning of this class, we've been talking about these thinkers who have been writing during this Enlightenment period, in which they're trying to throw off the dogmatic shackles placed on thought and inquiry by religion and the Catholic Church that is so pronounced and has an extremely firm grasp on power in the European and external world and nations. And so these guys that are writing during the Enlightenment period are really trying to utilize reason and logic in discussing and explaining the world around them. Kant is a rationalist. He believes that knowledge is primarily gained through reason. And so one of the methodologies that we're going to see him use today in trying to figure out this whole morality thing is reason and deduction. He's trying to corroborate the supreme principle of morality, as he calls it, using only a priori reason. No experience, nothing tied to experience, nothing based on our own personal experiences in life. He's trying to make sense of this concept of morality, or what would be required for this concept to make sense in the way that we use it out in the world and how we think about it, using only reason. Just starting from the concepts of things and working our way down from there. So, that is one of the reasons why he's writing in this overly technical style. Let's say this, to identify. So although we are transitioning into a new unit this week, namely Unit 2, the unit of ethics and metaethics, in which we're going to try to talk about some different theories for what makes an action moral or immoral, and how we might determine what actions to do in the future. We're still going to be dealing, however, with a little bit of metaphysics and epistemology. Because in order for Kant to make the argument that he's going to make as to what morality is and how it works, we need to talk about the existence or the metaphysics of morality. Which is why I decided to assign for you an excerpt from his book, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, in which he's trying to explain this underlying concept of morality that we utilize every day, but we don't really think about what it entails or what that principle rests on. So another way to say that is, not only in this piece is Kant trying to explain to us what makes an action moral or immoral, he's looking to explain what would be required for our concept of morality to make sense as we use it daily. We all implicitly utilize and evaluate people's actions based on a certain conception of morality. Whether we realize it or not, we all kind of have a similar conception. That conception is something like this. There are some things that people do that it doesn't matter what the situation is, that thing is always blameworthy. It's not a good thing. For example, can we all agree in this class that torturing a child for fun is never moral? Do we all kind of accept that? Maybe you want to say something like, look, if the fate of the world depends on torturing a child for fun, then it's a moral thing. But I think a lot of us would kind of be a little towards that kind of view. So what Kant is trying to elucidate here in these pages is, what is this concept of morality that we all implicitly understand and utilize? What is required for it? And then how do we determine whether or not one of our actions is moral or immoral? He's trying to do all of these things in these pages. Thank you. This is one of the ethical theories that we're going to look at in this unit. There are multiple ways to analyze whether or not an action is moral or immoral. The first theory that we're going to look at, Kant's theory, is called Deontology. Deontology has the root deon from Greek, meaning duty. So when Kant is trying to explain to us what's required for our concept of duty to make sense, what our duties are and what they look like, he's going to be putting forth an ethical theory that says the morality of an action is determined by whether or not that action is in line with what our duty is. Our duties to ourselves, our duties to other people, and perhaps our duty also to God. To give you a little sneak peek, Kant basically thinks that there is this objective and universal moral law that determines what our duties are. And if we're going to do a moral action, our actions need to be in line or permitted by that universal objective moral law that holds for all people at all times. Might be able to do this. Does that help a little bit? And this kind of fits in line with what our intuitive sense of morality is, right? That there is some principle or law that we're all trying to abide by that holds for everyone. Maybe we have some sort of sense that, cultures do things differently and we should be compassionate and tolerant of how other cultures do things. But by and large, we would say torturing a child for fun is immoral in North America, it's immoral in Africa, and it's immoral in Asia, across the board. It doesn't matter what the situation is. Maybe, torturing a child for fun, for pleasure, is just one of those things that's always bad. What that moral law says, or what that moral law permits us to do, is one of the things that Kant is trying to get us to see in these pages, in this book. He's trying to explain to us what that moral law is and what it rests on. Okay. Now let's jump into kind of Kant's extended argument and analysis as to what this moral law looks like and how we know what it is and what it says. Because Kant is one of these Enlightenment thinkers, and he's a rationalist, and he's going to be utilizing reason and deduction in order to explain this morality and ethics stuff, he's going to end up saying something like, in order to do moral stuff, we need to have the capacity for reason, and that somehow our reasoning capacities and our reasoning faculties are intimately bound up with figuring out what is moral and then following through on moral actions when the opportunities present themselves. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is kind of sketch for you Kant's overall view. I'm going to try to give you kind of a bare bones explanation of what he's saying and how his argument and analysis goes. And then hopefully all of this will become a little bit more clear to you when I show you a little video summarizing these things. So the first thing that Kant wants us to observe in order to understand this morality stuff is that the universe works according to laws. Everything natural that exists work according to laws. So we should expect the same of morality too. For example, physical things like matter, atoms, light, waves, chemicals, they obey physical laws, what are known as the laws of nature. Like charges repel each other, right? If you have two protons and you put them close, they're going to repel each other because they have the same charge. That's a law of nature. Dissimilar charges, if you have a proton and an electron, attract, right? That's a law of nature. Things can only go as fast as the speed of light in our universe. That's a law of nature. There are certain bounds or laws that are baked into the structure of reality that determine how things operate and how things work and the relationships that things have to one another. Physical things obey the laws of nature. We can also talk about laws operating in the realm of rationality. If you're a being who's rational, if you're trying to be rational, then you obey the laws of rationality. Let's say you really want ice cream. You really want ice cream, you have a taste for it, you have a craving for it, and you're trying to reason out, how am I going to get this ice cream? If logic tells you that the only way you're going to get ice cream is by going to the store, because Instacart and GoPuff and all these apps are closed down for the day, you got to go to the store to get ice cream, then if you're rational, you're going to follow what reason tells you to do, right? You're going to say, okay, if I want ice cream, I got to go to the store and buy it, so I'm going to do that. Or if you're trying to figure out how to solve some other problem, let's say you have finances that you need to get in order, and you're using reason and you're thinking through, how am I going to manage my finances? How am I going to make sure I don't spend too much money every month? Maybe a reason will tell you, create a spreadsheet to track your purchases and your income and all that. If you're a rational being, you're going to obey what reason tells you to do. You're going to obey the laws of reason. Well, the same thing applies to morality too. If you're trying to be moral, you're going to obey what Kant calls the moral law, or the laws of morality. the whole universe, from how knowledge works, to how reason operates, to how physical things work, to how morality works, everything works according to laws. And these laws don't just constrict individual people's actions and desires and plans, right? It's not as if the law of like charges repelling works only in this room, right? No, like charges repel everywhere in the universe, right? The physical laws that govern how tables and chairs and electrons and atoms work, they hold everywhere in the universe, right? The laws are universal. In the same way, the laws of rationality and the laws of morality are going to be universal. They're going to hold for all beings that are capable of rationality and all beings that are capable of morality. So, what Kant is trying to explain to us in these pages is this underlying moral law that we use to evaluate our actions and other people's actions that are universal, they hold for all people everywhere, all rational beings everywhere, and objective. The moral law doesn't depend on our particular desires, our particular beliefs or preferences. There's a moral law out there that we ought to follow because that's the right thing to do. And it doesn't depend on what I want to do for that day or how I'm feeling. Like the laws of nature, physical laws, the laws of morality are going to be objective and universal. And what is perhaps most important to understand about Kant's methodology here and his understanding of morality is that this law, this moral law that determines whether our actions are moral or immoral, we can discover and follow that moral law just through reason. In fact, that's the only way to figure out what it is. We can't understand what the moral law is through our personal experience, because our personal experience is always dealing with particular singular things in reality. But we're looking for something that's objective and universal and holds for all people, so we can't just rely on our own personal experiences to tell us what's right. We need to do the logical analysis and figuring it out using reason. And that is what Kant is doing in this whole piece, is he's trying to do this logical, rational analysis. He's trying to take you on this journey in which, using only reason, using only deduction, he's going to get you to see what that moral law is, based on no prior experience. Based on none of what your or his personal experiences have been. So all of his analysis of this morality stuff is going to be done through reason a priori, not relying on a personal experience at all. Just logic and deduction. Now, Kant thinks that this concept of morality that we utilize and rely on are bound up somehow with duties that we have. That's why his theory is called Deontology, is because it has to do with our duties and following our duties to ourselves, others, and to God. So in this piece, we see him explaining to us morality through discussions of duties and what our duties are and what it looks like to follow our duties. And he helpfully lists for us what some of these duties are that we all kind of implicitly accept and follow. We all have a duty to preserve our own lives. We also have a duty to be kind and helpful when we can. To help people out when we can, when it's not too much of a risk or cost to us. And then he says, indirectly, we also have a duty to secure our own happiness. These are just some of the duties Kant thinks we have to ourselves and to others. And I think we all kind of accept these, right? Is there anyone who disagrees that we should be doing these things? Do you disagree that you should preserve your own life, generally? How about to help people out when you can? That seems reasonable, right? It seems like something we all agree with.
Didn't you mention something about doing what you're good at, basically? Isn't like another one what you do saying? I don't know, maybe I'm picking it up, but I thought you said something about if you're good at the skill, it's your duty to use that skill. That's the easiest way I can put it.
He probably thinks we have a duty to develop our talents.
Yeah, it was something along that line.
Yeah. That would fit right in line with his thinking. Yeah. We have a duty to ourselves to maybe, not sit on our asses and eat Cheetos and play video games all day. But, to, if we love painting, to get better at painting. If we're good at dancing, to do dance. To develop our talents. Yeah, that would fit in line with what he says. Now, if you want to understand what Kant thinks makes an action moral or immoral, you can simplify it like this. He thinks that the morality of an action is going to be based on whether or not it proceeds from what our duties are. If it has to do with willing keeping our duties and not forsaking them. But he's got a particular view of how moral action is supposed to go. He's going to say that moral actions are motivated merely by respect for the moral law. In other words, when we're trying to perform a moral action, for Kant, the moral action is one that you do just because it's the right thing to do. This is what he means by merely by respect for the moral law. We see what the moral law is and we recognize that's the right thing to do. I'm going to do it just because it's the right thing to do. If you perform an action that you think is good, that's in what you might call conformity with duty. It doesn't contradict what your duties are, but it's based on a desire, a personal desire, or you're trying to get something out of it, or it's based on your own self-interest. That cheapens the action, Kant thinks. If you help the old lady across the street because you get all these nice feelings inside when you do that, and that's why you do it, you didn't do a moral thing. You did it because it felt good. And that doesn't make the action moral, Kant thinks. In order to do the moral thing, you just have to have respect for the moral law. You see what's right, and then you do it just because it's the right thing to do. You don't do it because you're trying to get money out of it. You don't do it because it's going to make you all feel fuzzy and butterflies inside. You don't do it because you're going to get money. If any of those considerations figure into you doing the moral thing, it cheapens the action. And it's not a purely moral action on Kant's view.
So that kind of confused me because, like, what if, like, doing the action and you just thought, oh, I'm going to help this lady because that's the right thing to do. But then you do feel good about yourself afterwards, and that's just like an after effect. Like,
Then it's fine.
then it's fine if it's, like, not for, like, I'm going to do this action because it'll make me feel good. You just did the action and then you're after, like, oh, that made me feel good. That's okay.
Yeah, it's fine to feel good when you do moral things. It's fine to be rewarded for your moral actions. As long as those reasons don't figure into why you did the thing that you did, then you're good to go on Kant's view. But yeah, it's fine to feel nice when you help the old lady across the street. It's fine to accept payment, for doing a service for somebody, even if you were just doing it to be nice. As long as that didn't figure into why you did it in the first place. It wasn't a reason for your doing that thing. Then you're fine. So he's going to kind of propose for us this cold, kind of calculating, rational view of morality, in which we just got to do what's right because it's right. And none of our personal desires or interests or inclinations should figure into our decision making as to what's moral. Does that make sense? It kind of has this view of humans as a cold, rational computer, but we'll come back to that. Kant makes a further claim. Kant doesn't think that beings that don't have reason can be moral. So when you look at the actions of animals, we don't say that lion shouldn't have killed that gazelle, right? We don't say that the lion did an immoral thing. Kant kind of takes this point and runs with it, because he thinks that, first of all, in order to recognize what the moral law is, and then in order to follow it, you need to have reason. If you don't have reason, you can't be a moral being. So he's going to say that only a rational being, only humans, who have the capacity to determine which actions are morally permitted, can be moral.
Is that like saying you can't blame a dog if they bite somebody? Like you shouldn't punch them, or not punch. You shouldn't punish them.
Yeah.
Because they don't know any better.
Well, we can distinguish here between morally blaming them and maybe conditioning them so they don't do that in the future. Right? Yeah, Kant would say it doesn't make sense to tell the dog, you're a bad dog, morally, because the dog is a dog. It can't think through its actions. But we can condition the dog so it doesn't bite someone in the future. That's fine. But any moral claims about animals don't make sense on Kant's view. We only apply morality to rational beings, because they have the ability to think through their actions and to determine what's right and wrong. And the reason Kant believes this is it's intimately wrapped up with his theory of rationality and how rationality is tied to morality. I'm going to get to kind of why he thinks only rational beings can be moral here in a little bit. But it's something important to write down and think about in order to understand exactly what Kant is saying in this book. All right. Let's now talk about what Kant thinks makes an action moral or immoral. We've gone over it a little bit, but now let's actually put it on the board in easily expressible and noticeable terms. If you'd like to follow along with me, I'm looking at page 7, the last paragraph on page 7 in our reading. I'm going to read from 7 to 8. This is Kant explaining what makes an action moral or immoral. An action from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose that is to be attained by it, not your goal of the action, but in the maxim according to which it is resolved upon. And thus, it does not depend on the actuality of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of willing, according to which the action is done. So what Kant is saying here is, what makes your actions moral or immoral is not your goal. Let's say your goal is world peace. That doesn't make your action moral or immoral, right? We can all imagine a situation in which your goal is world peace, but if you have to kill half the population to do it, maybe you didn't do a moral thing, right? So it's not the goal of your actions that makes them moral or immoral. Similarly, it's not whether or not you achieved your goal. Imagine a firefighter who tries to rush into a burning building to save a child. If the firefighter doesn't succeed, we don't blame him, right? We don't say, you did something immoral by failing to save the child, right? No, we would commend his action, and we would say, you did a good thing by rushing in there to try to save the child, but, I'm sorry it didn't work out. So he's saying, what makes an action moral or immoral is not your goal, it's not the end of what you're doing, and it's not whether or not you achieved that end. It's something else. Continuing on, that the purposes that we may have when we act and their efforts as ends and incentives of the will can bestow on actions no unconditional and moral worth is clear from what we previously said. In what then do the moral worth of our actions lie, if it is not to consist in the will with reference to their hoped-for effect? It can lie nowhere else than in the principle of the will, regardless of the ends that can be affected by such action. For the will stands halfway between its a priori principle, which is formal, and its a posteriori incentive, which is material, as it were, at a crossroads. And since the will must be determined by something, it will have to be determined by the formal principle of willing. As such, when an action is done from duty, as every material principle has been taken away from it. Thus, the third proposition, as the conclusion from both previous ones, I would express is as follows. Duty is the necessity of an action from respect for the moral law. For the object as the effect of the action I have in mind, I can indeed have an inclination, but never respect, precisely because it is merely an effect and not an activity of the will. Going down a little bit. Now, an action from duty is to separate off entirely the influence of any inclination, any personal desire or personal motivation for that action, and with it every object of the will. Thus, nothing remains for the will that could determine it except objectively the law, and subjectively pure respect for this practical law. and hence the maxim of complying with such a law, even if it infringes on all my inclinations. So what Kant is saying here is, if we're all going to have and utilize this concept of morality that says there's a right thing to do that is objective and universal for everyone, that doesn't depend on the day of the week, that doesn't depend on your personal beliefs or desires, that doesn't depend on where you live, that what makes an action moral then can only be based on us recognizing what the law is and choosing rationally to following it. If we're motivated to follow the moral law because it makes us feel good, or we're going to get money, or any other personal inclination or desire, that cheapens the action. It's not a moral action if all of that other stuff, those personal desires and wishes, figure into why we do the moral thing. Thus, the moral worth of an action, whether or not an action is moral or immoral, is based on two things. The first is that it's motivated out of pure respect for the moral law. We're just doing it because it's right, and no other reason. Our only motivation for the moral action is that it's right, and not because it makes us feel good or because it's going to get us money. So once you've finished writing this a little bit, I'll explain this in other words. The first thing to note is that if you're going to do a moral action according to Kant, it needs to be done purely from duty, purely by recognizing what the right thing to do is and then doing it, not being motivated out of personal interest or personal desire or hoping to get something out of it. The second thing that determines whether our action is moral or immoral is the underlying rule or principle that is the reason for our action. Kant thinks, whether we realize it or not, every action that we do has some underlying basis or reason to it, called the principle or the maxim. That principle or maxim from which our actions flow needs to have certain properties and a certain character in order for that action to be moral. We're about to get into what exactly those properties need to be. But basically what Kant is getting at is the morality of an action needs to be, your motivation for that action needs to be just because it's the right thing to do. And then the rule that you live by that made you do that action in that circumstance, the rule needs to be formulated in the right way. And if you got those two things, then your action is moral. But if the rule that you live by that motivated the action doesn't have certain properties, it's immoral. Or if you did the action, because you wanted money or because you wanted to feel good, for example, then that action is also immoral. Now let's talk about exactly what this principle or maxim thing is. Kant thinks that every one of our actions, logically, we can explain those actions in terms of a rule or a principle or a maxim that we live by. But in order for the actions that follow from those rules that we live by to be moral, those rules need to be formulated in a certain way. You can't just live by any old rule and say that your actions are moral. The rules need to conform to certain criteria. In order to talk about what these criteria are, we need to talk about what Kant calls imperatives. Because we're rational beings, because we have reason, there are certain things that reason tells us to do that are dependent on our goals and our circumstances, right? When we're trying to figure out what's rational to do in a situation, or what's moral to do in a situation, because Kant thinks that actually morality is nested inside rationality, we need to look at the kind of imperatives that our reason gives us, that our reason tells us to do. And these imperatives come in two different forms. He says reason hands us hypothetical imperatives, and reason hands us categorical imperatives. He talks about this on page 11 in the document, which, if you look at the page numbers on the bottom of the book, is going to be page 27. How we picture a rule to live by, an objective rule to live by in our minds, insofar as it tells us to do something, or is necessitating for the will, as he says, is called a command of reason. And the formula of this command is called imperative. All imperatives are expressed by an ought. When you're thinking rationally or morally what to do, reason says you ought to do this thing, or you ought to do that thing, or you ought to do this thing. And by this, the ought indicates the relation of the objective law of reason to a will that, according to its own subjective constitution, is not necessarily determined by it. So, our reason recognizes that there are rational rules or objective rules to live by. And when we think about that, we're like, all right, if I'm going to be rational, I have to do this. But it's up to us to decide whether or not we actually do what reason tells us to do. Right? We don't have to follow what is rational. We don't have to follow what is moral. But we feel a certain motivation to do so. Right? Like, our reasoning capacities makes us feel instinctively or inherently that we should do what reason or morality tells us to do. But we don't have to. Right? You can do the moral thing or the immoral thing. You can do the rational thing or the irrational thing. You have some sort of power or ability to decide what you do. But if you're trying to be rational or moral, you're going to follow what the rational law says for you to do. And you're going to follow what the moral law says you to do. Skipping to the next page. Now, all imperatives, things that our reason tells us to do, are either hypothetical or categorical. Hypothetical imperatives represent the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else that one wants. So, reason tells us to do certain things based on what our goals are. Your goal is to get a college degree. Right? That's a goal that you have in your mind. So reason is going to tell you, go to class, do your homework, pay attention, get your assignments in on time. Right? Relative to your goal of getting a college degree, reason tells you to do all of this stuff. Those are examples of hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives tell you what to do to reach a certain goal. So, for example, if your goal is to get ice cream, a hypothetical imperative would be, you gotta go to the store to get ice cream. Or, go to class in order to get your college degree, right? All of us have many of these hypothetical imperatives. We all have certain goals, certain things that we want to achieve, and so reason is going to tell us what steps we need to take in order to reach those goals. Those steps are hypothetical imperatives. What reason is telling you to do to reach a certain goal is a hypothetical imperative. Because you could have other goals, right? You could have other ends, other things that you want. But because you personally have some certain goals, reason is going to tell you to do certain things that it may not tell me to do because I have other goals. Right? My goal is not to get a college degree. So I am not going to turn my assignments in on time. I don't have any assignments to do. Right? So our hypothetical imperatives are going to be relative to the goals that we have. What reason tells you to do in a certain situation is going to be relative to the goals that you have. But not all things that reason tells you to do. There are some things that reason tells you to do that you just ought to do. And it doesn't matter what your goals are. This is what Kant calls categorical imperatives. It doesn't matter what your goals are. It doesn't matter what your hypothetical desires and wishes are in the future, what you want to get out of life. There are certain things that reason tells us to do just because it's rational. And categorical imperatives hold for all rational beings. All rational beings are told by reason to do things just because it's rational, not relative to any of our personal or individual goals. morality is an example of a categorical imperative. The concept of morality that we utilize and by which we evaluate other people's actions is not based on their goals. It's just based on because it's moral or because it's rational. Right? If someone were to come up to you and say, "Oh, I killed this guy to further my career," you'd say, "What? You're not supposed to kill a guy, even if it's to further your career." Right? Morality tells us you don't kill people. Morality is an example of a categorical imperative. It tells us what's necessary to do just because it's rational, or just because it's moral, in this example. It doesn't matter that your goal is to further your career. It doesn't matter that, you had a fight with your wife, and in order to stop the tension at home, you kill her. No, that's not appropriate. Right? And we all have this deep sense that no matter what the situation is, there are certain actions that are not appropriate. Certain lines that we don't cross. Right? This is what Kant is trying to explain in this very technical, abstract way. Is he says there are some things that we know to do and not do just because. And it's not relative to any goals or desires that we have. Continuing on, the categorical imperative would be the one that represented an action as objectively necessary by itself, without reference to another end or goal. Because every practical law represents a possible action as good, and hence, for a subject practically determinable by reason as necessary, all imperatives are formulae for the determination of an action necessary according to the principle of a will that is good in some way. Now, if the action would be good merely as a means to something else, that imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as good in itself, hence as necessary in a will that conforms to reason, as its principle, then it is categorical. And so Kant is going to say, our duties are of this categorical nature. Our duties don't depend on what our goals and desires are, our moral duties. We just ought to do them, because that's the right thing to do. The way we use morality, the way that we understand it, is we have this kind of conception in mind. We have this idea that there are right and wrong things that we should and shouldn't do just because. That's one of the main points Kant is making here. And again, in his overly abstract technical way. So, we know that morality is something that holds for all rational people. It's something that reason tells all rational people to do just because it's the right thing to do. But we haven't figured out yet exactly how to determine if an action is moral or immoral, right? We know that we have certain duties to people. We know that we ought to do them just because. But Kant still hasn't told us exactly what those actions are, or how to figure out whether an action is going to be moral or immoral. Now let's talk about how we do that exactly according to Kant. Kant says we can figure out what actions are moral or immoral by applying a certain test to our maxims or to the rules that we live by. If the rule that we live by passes this test, then the actions that flow from that rule are going to be moral. In his overly technical way, Kant says, okay, here is the criterion that your rule that you're living by needs to have in order for the actions that flow from that rule to be moral. He gives us two different ways of conceiving of, two different ways of testing whether the rules that we live by are going to allow us or permit moral things. The first test is what he calls the first formulation of the categorical imperative. He says, if you want to make sure you're doing moral stuff, act only according to that maxim or rule through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law of nature. In other words, if we're trying to look at the rules that we live by, let's say you have a rule to live by that is don't murder. If we're trying to determine if that rule is going to permit moral actions, what we need to do is we need to try to conceptualize whether or not that rule could be a universal law of nature so that everybody would have to follow it. If we can't imagine or conceive that it's a universal law of nature, or if there are problems, practical or logical problems, with trying to instantiate one of our rules as a law of nature, there are issues doing that, then that's not a rule that you can live by that will generate moral actions for you. In other words, to determine what's moral, we test the rules that we live by to see if it could become a universal law that everything in the universe would have to follow. Let's take an easy example. Let's say this is a rule that I live by, let's say. Every Wednesday, go to the university store and buy shorts. Can we universalize that rule? Can we conceive of that being a universal law of nature that everybody would have to follow? Could everybody follow that rule? No. Why can't everybody follow that rule? Right. There are so many practical issues with this, right? First of all, we would need 7.8 billion pairs of shorts stocked in the campus store. The store can't fit that many shorts. everybody would have to have the money necessary to pay for those shorts, which not everybody has. Everybody would somehow have to organize transportation every Wednesday to come to this store and buy those shorts. Practically, this is impossible, right? For all these reasons. So this hypothetical rule that we could live by, this maxim, buy shorts every Wednesday at the campus store, is not universalizable. So it's not going to generate purely moral actions if we follow that rule. So if you try to universalize a maxim and it fails because of practical considerations, like the people don't have enough money or they can't get to the store or all these things, it's not a rule that's going to generate for us only moral actions. So we got to throw it out. We can't live by that rule. But there's another way that a maxim can be defeated, that a maxim cannot be universalized. And this is logically. What if I lived by this rule? What if my rule was, when I'm low on money, I always write bad checks to people? Is that a rule that we could universalize? Is that a rule that everybody could follow? When you don't have the money to pay for something, write a bad check. Why not? What are you saying, Delta?
So if everyone keeps writing bad checks, eventually no one's gonna have any money.
There might be practical considerations. Maybe there aren't enough checks in the world for us to do that every time. But the reason that this is not a rule that we can follow is because logically it defeats itself. If everybody were to write bad checks when they needed to buy something and didn't have money, the whole activity of check cashing would go out the window. If everybody wrote bad checks, soon nobody would accept any checks, because all the institutions would say, oh, these are just all bad checks, we're not accepting checks anymore. So the whole activity of check writing and cashing would disappear. And that's not something that could happen, actually, like in reality, right? If we tried to instantiate a rule as a universal law of nature that erases itself, that's not a rule that can persist in the universe. Logically, it defeats itself. Or think about suicide, for example. Kant's going to say suicide is immoral because, let's say you lived by the following rule. Whenever life is too hard for me, commit suicide. We can't instantiate that as a possible law of nature because then there would be no life left in the universe. If everything followed that rule, then we would be using life to snuff life out. So it's self-defeating. That rule would not be able to be instantiated as a law of nature, because if everyone followed it, there would be no beings to follow the law anymore. Right? Everything would kill itself at some point in their lives, and it would never procreate and pass on its genes. So when you're trying to determine if an action is moral or immoral, you look at the rule that you're trying to live by. And then you try to see if you could make that rule a universal law of nature. In your head, think about it. If you can't, if there are practical reasons why you can't make it a universal law of nature that everything would have to follow, or if there are logical problems doing that, that's not a rule that you can live by. That's not an appropriate maxim that's going to generate moral actions. And so maxims are defeated if willing it or universalizing it are impossible or self-defeating. Let's take a different example. What if I try to live by the following rule? Every time it's advantageous to me, lie. Could we make that rule a universal law of nature? Whenever it is advantageous to you, lie. Deceive others to get your way. Can we make that a universal law of nature? I see some people shaking their heads. Why can't we make that a universal law of nature?
Because how do you make it consistent for every person? So I'm looking at it and like, how do you scale it and say, okay, will this decision be the same for these two people? Maybe it's not equal. You get what I'm saying?
I'm not sure I do. Could you explain it in a different way?
Like, it'd be the same way as saying, like, every time something upsets you, like, lie about it. But this something that may upset this person, you might do the same thing to this person, it doesn't upset them. So, like, how do you...
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, maybe. Maybe that defeats the maxim. I have another reason in mind, though.
I mean, if everyone was lying whenever it was like helpful to them, it would stop. There would be like a fundamental trust that people have for others would disappear if people were lying that often.
Right. So think about it like this. If we made that a law of nature, every organism deceive another organism to get ahead, or when it's advantageous to you, what are the consequences of that? Well, if every human would lie to get ahead, then no human would learn to trust another human, right? Because we would all think everybody's lying to us all the time, right? But then, if none of us trusted each other, it would not be possible for anyone to deceive anyone else, right? Because in order to deceive someone, there needs to be trust there first. And so if we tried to make this lying a universal law of nature, it defeats itself because nobody would be able to lie to anybody else because nobody would be deceived by anybody anymore. So we wouldn't be able to follow the rule because deceit would not be possible in that universe if everybody lied. Does that make sense? It's a weird way of thinking about what makes a rule an appropriate rule, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Like, there are some lies that you could tell that, like, would be to your advantage in the end, but then, like, I feel like if you got caught in the lie, in that scenario, it would be worse. Because, like, it also doesn't prove that, like, when you lie, that somebody's going to believe you or not.
Right. Right, yeah.
If somebody doesn't know the truth or not. Like, if somebody, I always bring up murder, I'm sorry. But, like, if somebody was like, you know, somebody murdered somebody and they're like, didn't do it, the cop isn't going to be like, well, he said he didn't do it, so obviously he didn't do it. Like,
Right. Practically, such a universe where everything lied to everything else would not be possible. But logically, trying to instantiate this defeats itself. And there would be no more deceit, and so lying would not be possible. So, one way to try to determine if our actions are moral or immoral is to try to get to, well, what rule am I trying to follow by doing this action? And then can I universalize that rule? And if you can't, that means the actions that flow from it, you can't guarantee they're going to be moral. So you got to throw the rule out. But there's an even more simple formulation that Kant gives us that I think helps explain what makes action moral or immoral even better. And that's his second formulation. This one is a little more intuitive, and I think this might be an easier way of determining whether or not your actions are moral or immoral. Because this universalizing business can get quite tricky and complex, right? Like if you're trying to do this mental exercise every time you're trying to determine what to do, I don't know, that might bog you down a little bit. But Kant says, I've got another way to figure out if your actions are moral or immoral. And that's my second formulation. And Kant says, supposedly, if you do the mental exercise correctly, every rule or action that is moral that you derive from the first formulation, you can also derive from this formulation. So both of these ways of looking at morality are going to tell us all the same things as to what to do and not do. And the second formulation is this. Act that you use humanity never merely as a means, but always as an end. In other words, never treat another person merely as an object. Because we are all rational beings, and we exist